objects.
You are listening to a universe of possibilities. This is Astronomy FM.
Coming up next, an Astronomy.fm original program. It's time for York Universe, a co-production of the Observatory of York University, Toronto, and the Voice of Astronomy. AFM Radio, AFM Radio, AFM Radio, AFM Radio.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to York Universe, the astronomy and astrophysics program written and presented by the students, faculty, alumni, and friends of York University. This evening, I will be your main host. My name is Ryan, and I'm going to be joined by two others. One who is a host, a Torontonian, a really interesting guy. I've had a little bit of a chance to talk with him. Quentin Wayridge, York alumnus and outreach coordinator at the David Dunlap Observatory in Richmond Hill. Hi, Quentin. How are you?
Hey, I'm great. I'm really glad to be on the air tonight.
Excellent. And we also have a very special guest who I'm going to introduce after we introduce the start of the show, because I'm very excited to have her with us today. But we are broadcasting live from the Alan I. Carswell Observatory, located at York University in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And this is Science Night in Canada, where our lineup is all Canadian. We start with ourselves, York Universe, and then go on to Western World's Quirks and Quarks and Science for the People. York Universe broadcasts every Monday night at 9 p.m. local Toronto time, which is right about now, or Tuesday morning at 2 a.m. UT. The York Universe production works in concert with the online public viewing program run by the Observatory team, which runs from 9 to 10 p.m. local Toronto time, or right now. If you want to follow the links and join the chat, you can go to observatory.info.yorku.ca. Our broadcast is powered by and in partnership with Astronomy.fm, the voice of astronomy. For any questions or comments you have of our past shows, or if you have any suggestions for future topics, please send us an email at observe@yorku.ca. We also have a Twitter handle at York Observatory, Instagram, YorkU Observatory, and Facebook at Alan I. Carswell OBS. And all of our programs are free, but if you would like to make a donation, you can see our website, observatory.info.yorku.ca. Always a mouthful to introduce the show, but now I get to do another mouthful to introduce our very special guest. And you can imagine that it's related to the Artemis launch, or almost launch, this morning. Our guest today is Naomi Paquette. Naomi Paquette is a science communicator and astrophysicist. She's the owner of Peak Nova Solutions, a space science education company, and is also an adjunct professor of astronomy at the University of Denver in Colorado. Previously, Naomi worked at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, where she led the education program and content development for the redesign of the Space Odyssey exhibition, as well as pioneered a new era of live programs in the Gates Planetarium. Naomi and Peak Nova Solutions are the curator of a private collection of Apollo-era artifacts that include engineering models, spaceflight components, film, and more. She's also a co-author of the new book, The Science of Sci-Fi Cinema, which was featured on Engadget. And we had a great little discussion before the show about the DeLorean being a space and time machine. But we'll get to all that stuff. Naomi, thank you for joining us. How are you this evening?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm great. Love to be here and chat with all of you in Toronto from Colorado.
Yeah, it's one of the things I love about an online radio show is that we can talk to people from anywhere. I suppose any radio show can do that, but I always like to branch out a little bit and talk to people all across the country, the continent, and the world, which I haven't done quite yet. But we're going to talk a lot today about the Artemis moon missions. And especially, we kind of planned out this show to be celebrating the launch of Artemis, but of course that didn't exactly happen this morning for a few reasons, which I'm sure we'll dive into. But our discussion for the show today is going to focus mostly on Artemis and kind of why Artemis is a thing. But to start us off with what it is, Naomi, do you think you could tell us a little bit about the Artemis moon missions?
Yeah, so the Artemis moon missions are NASA's next step in human spaceflight. Really, NASA's goals are not only to return us to the moon here with Artemis, but we have an eye of going towards Mars and sending humans to our closest planet. And Artemis is a key part of that by starting at a proving ground, if you will, a location not super far from Earth compared to Mars at least, but much further away than we're flying now. So we're looking at establishing a more long-term presence on the moon through these Artemis missions.
And that is the next, as you said, the next step to eventually landing humans on Mars. And that's, I mean, a lot of people romanticize the moon and Mars, but I was like the moon because it's something that's really accessible to everybody, right? Everybody can see the moon. I mean, pretty much everybody, unless we live in a cave. But throughout the world, we can all see the moon, so we have this kind of romantic connection to it. Now, you might think of Apollo being the original moon missions. Artemis is not quite crewed just yet. We're not sending people to the moon right away, right? Although we do have a couple of tag-alongs on this mission.
We do have some tag-alongs. Although no humans yet, Artemis 1 is our test mission. We can think back to that era of Apollo, right? We had to prove ourselves capable and to be safe with sending humans to the moon. And so for Artemis, this is sending an uncrewed 42-day mission with some tag-alongs, as you mentioned, some mannequins with some testing equipment. We're going to measure radiation exposure. But my favorite tag-along is the little Snoopy. That's going to be our zero gravity indicator that hark back to
That's lovely.
kid stuffed R2-D2 when he flew to the ISS on the Soyuz capsule in 2015. And Bob and Doug brought a stuffed dinosaur that was their kid's favorite toy. So I like that there's whimsy in the space program.
And well, the mannequins have names too, right? They're Helga and Zohar.
Yes. And Commander Moonkin Campos as well.
Oh, really? Okay, I missed that one.
That one is the American one, and that one actually is named for some history with the spaceflight program, and he even has his own set of cartoons through NASA, so you can follow him as well.
Oh, very neat. I love it. And, you know, between all of these instruments, aside from, you know, the zero-G indicator, the mannequins have a lot more sensors. I think between Helga and Zohar, they have about 5,600 sensors between them to measure everything from radiation to force of gravity, all of that stuff. So there's a lot of value that's going to come from not having humans on this mission when it does eventually launch.
Yeah. Absolutely. And these are things we want to know ahead of time. We are, for one of the first times in 50 years, traveling outside of our Van Allen radiation belts, right? We're going to see a lot more radiation exposure when we travel to the moon. And especially with an eye on longer missions of setting up more permanent base camps on the moon, we want to understand the health effects on humans before we send them out there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, human spaceflight has come such a long way since the Apollo missions, right? I mean, that's the whole point of the International Space Station, is to have an orbiting laboratory where we can test very easily, well, not easily, but more easily than sending astronauts to the moon. We can test the effects of microgravity on humans, of prolonged spaceflight on humans. And since the crewed missions on the ISS have been running for the past 2 decades, more than that now, we have a much better idea of what it takes to keep human beings alive. And so, as you said, Naomi, the moon is the proving ground for that. But the question I had for you is, you have a lot of knowledge about Apollo. Are there a lot of similarities between what you're seeing with the development and work with Artemis to what the Apollo missions kind of did with gathering a little bit of data, building upon itself, that kind of thing?
There definitely are some similarities. I mean, the most obvious similarity is, of course, the crew module itself. Orion looks very similar to that Apollo command module, taking some inspiration, although bigger, better, higher tech. But in terms of building, we are absolutely still doing that, although it feels much more accelerated than the Apollo missions. We started so modularly with with Mercury and then Gemini, and every single mission built, even through the early Apollo missions. And when we're looking at Artemis, we have to recognize variations of this program have been discussed since the Bush era here in the US, 2004, although this officially got kicked off in 2011. And so we're looking at now just 3 missions. We were on Apollo 11 before we landed on the moon. This will be Artemis 3. So it does feel faster, but we have learned from our long history of spaceflight and the International Space Station, as you mentioned.
It's really funny to talk about this Artemis moving faster than Apollo, right? Apollo was literally the space race, right? It was like, we have to get to the moon first. We have to orbit the Earth first. We have to send humans to space first. It's so funny to think about Artemis as moving faster than that, and especially with what I imagine is less funding as well. But I guess they're not reinventing the wheel, as you said.
Yeah, it's an interesting mix. I mean, we certainly were launching more missions per year during the Apollo era. We had to. Right, but we were starting from scratch of never having done a spacewalk, not having a space capsule, not having a spacesuit. And while all the technology for Artemis is new, we do need a new spacecraft, a spacesuit, because it's going to be different to maneuver on the moon. We need a new spacecraft to take us there. We need a new rocket. There are some learning benchmarks we can kind of lift off of, if you will. But the sheer number of missions is what's making it feel faster, even though the timeline is still multiple years long.
Yeah, and even the mission timelines are quite a bit longer. I mean, the trip to the moon for Apollo, it was 7 days, right? This mission is quite a bit longer. Right? There's a couple of orbit. There's a wide orbit, a couple of close swing bys. For the Artemis mission, it's 42 days, I think, was the original timeline. Although you had mentioned to me earlier that if it launches on Friday, it'll have to be a little bit shorter.
Yeah, so the first test mission, the goal is to have a full 42-day mission. Although if we launch on Friday, because of how we want to do the re-entry, we're looking at a 39-day mission. If we launch Monday, back to 42-day mission. But these are considerably longer, even when we look at the crewed missions moving forward with Artemis 2 and Artemis 3. We're looking at spending a week on the surface of the moon with Artemis 3 versus just, a couple days, that kind of down and back up, if you will, that Apollo did. And I think that is a testament to our learning of the effects of human spaceflight and what we are capable of, and also 58 years of new technology as well.
And 58 years to go from a grab and go to actually spending some time on the moon. Quentin, yeah, something to add.
Yeah, Naomi, could you elaborate a little bit on why the number of days that we would that the craft would spend in orbit around the moon would be different depending on which day of the week we launch on?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different factors that we look at for launch windows. Starting closest to home, frankly, satellites. We got a lot of them in our low Earth orbit and Earth orbit that we've got to get through and look at safety. Of course, weather. But then we need to look at the position of the moon. And then the re-entry is really interesting. It's what we call skip-off re-entry. So we're actually going to skip off the surface of, or part of the atmosphere, and then re-enter and come in, and that'll slow down the Orion capsule as it comes back in. And so it's this more complicated set of factors than we think of with an ISS launch, like a Crew Dragon launch, for example.
So it's literally going to skip like a stone off of the atmosphere.
It is. I don't know if that's comforting, cool. I don't. It's definitely a new thing to do, and it is going to help with that speed reduction coming in, putting less friction and heat and pressure on that heat shield, which is never a bad thing to have less of that.
Do we anticipate that these skip-off re-entries are going to be kind of the way the business is done in the future, or is this like still in the experimental stages? We're still trying to see if it's a good method.
You know, I'm not 100% sure on that one. I think that is the plan for the design with the Orion capsule heat shield, but I am not 100% sure. That's something we should definitely check out.
I suppose it depends on a lot of factors, right? Not only the design of the spacecraft, but where it's coming from. I mean, coming from further away, depending on how much fuel is left, can it take that kind of long swing into the atmosphere, or does it really need to come in at a high angle and find a way to slow down a little bit? So it's interesting to me that it can do this to kind of reduce the overall frictional load on the spacecraft. One of the things that people don't often talk about is just how difficult the atmosphere is for spaceflight. One of the things I often do with kids is we'll say, okay, have you ever stuck your hand out the window of the car while it's moving, and hopefully not too far out, but and done that hand surfing thing, right? That's the atmosphere pushing on you and pushing as the car goes faster. And now imagine sending a rocket at 10 kilometers a second, trying to get it out of the atmosphere. And then we talk about the rocket and we say, well, yeah, like 80% of that fuel, 80% of that rocket, that fuel is just to get it to go fast enough to get out of the atmosphere. And then everything's a little bit easier. So it makes sense to me that as difficult as it is to get off of the Earth and get out of the atmosphere, it would be just as difficult to come back in without destructive consequences, as we see with meteors every so often.
I was going to say shooting stars, and just having had the Perseid meteor shower, a great example of the power of the atmosphere to heat up pieces of things entering in. And I will say each of the Artemis missions, too, have a slightly different trajectory as well, because they all have different goals, right? We are going to be out there for quite a long time with this uncrewed mission. Artemis 2 will be orbiting the moon, and then Artemis 3 landing on the moon, ultimately, and taking that first woman and first person of color to the surface of the moon as
Artemis 1 is a flight test. We've engineered with rigor, but even the best models and tests aren't foolproof. As part of the review that they did at that time, we discussed managing expectations, realizing things may not go according to plan. However, our team is agile, and they're prepared for what space may throw at us as we push our vehicle to its limits. And I wanted to read that because I thought it was really interesting to the variation in the flight paths that you were talking about, the testing of everything, scrubbing the launch this morning. All of that is this agility that they're talking about. And I think it's so hard to be agile with so many moving parts and so many different people working on the same thing. But it's this philosophy that NASA has had since the Apollo missions, this flexibility, this willingness to not let our ego as humans, decide to just light the candle and launch, right? So I just think it's really, really interesting to think about just the differences and kind of how everything how it works with that.
Yeah, I think it's really important too, that flexibility and that importance of safety and of making sure things go well. I mean, we had 4 wet dress rehearsals for this rocket. Unfortunately, the one in June wasn't able to fully complete, which is possibly why some of the issues came about today. But it is a bunch of engineers highly dedicated to this craft, this rocket, this complicated space system, and to make sure the mission is successful, right? We don't want to, I heard someone say, light the candle when it's ready to blow. And so it is lucky and a testament to the care that all of these and flexibility these people have that we are watching that and making sure this is a successful mission when it does go.
Yeah, and the other thing is that I guess if anybody listening right now is disappointed that the launch didn't end up happening today, all that means is you get another opportunity to watch it later, right? So anybody listening now, it's what time is it going to be launching on, or is the expectation that it's going to be launching on Friday?
12:58 Eastern time, I believe, is the start of the launch window, and they've got I don't think they have the full 2-hour launch window on Friday. I don't know. It was a lot of coffee this morning being in Mountain Time.
I mean, we waited.
Things like these, there are delays. It's just a part of the process. The JWST was delayed for years, and it's launched now. So it's going to happen.
That's it. We waited 58 years. We can wait a little bit longer, right, for another moon launch. So that's totally fine. You were talking about safety a little bit, Naomi, and I think back to Challenger, Columbia, and honoring and what was the Apollo 1 as well, or was that Gemini the first?
Apollo 1, yeah.
It was Apollo 1, sorry.
Yeah.
And so, I think it does a service to those astronauts to make sure everything is safe, to make sure that the further we go, when there are more and more moving parts, that we honor the memories of those astronauts by making things as safe as possible, by testing things as rigorously as possible, and giving it the due diligence that would befit them as astronauts. But it honors their memories.
Certainly.
Absolutely. And it is, these are an amazing group of some of the most qualified and educated human beings that are willing to put their lives at risk for the future of exploration, right? The future of humanity. And so we definitely want to make sure they are as safe as possible. There's always risks. Look at Apollo 13, right? We had 2 successful moon landings when we have an issue with the Apollo spacecraft. Apollo 14 faced multiple issues, although it didn't end up scrubbing that mission. They were still able to land, right? Mm-hmm. But you want to make sure as much as you can that foundation is safe.
And foundation's a great word for that, because I think back to Apollo, and again, one of the things that you and I were talking about earlier today, when we were talking about differences between Apollo and Artemis, and the space race, and one of the things I thought about was how things are so different. We have such a different perspective of the space race today, 58 years later, having so much more information about what was going on back then that we just didn't have because of the Iron Curtain and secrecy and top secrecy and all that kind of thing. And you look at the Soviet Union really were trying to one-up the Americans. They were trying to say we were the first. And they were the first. Yuri Gagarin, the first person in space. They were the first to have a multi-crew spacecraft. They made a lot of those very early milestones. But one of the key differences was that the Soviets kind of came off of military technology. I mean, so did Apollo in a way. But coming off the military technology, they kept putting more and more things on their intercontinental ballistic missiles and saying, we'll get there. We'll just keep sending it up and we'll launch it earlier than the Americans do. Whereas with the Apollo program, especially after Apollo 1, the goal of Apollo was to build upon itself, was to build something that will work with everything that comes after it. to build a capsule that can be placed on a big rocket, that can get, the LEM, that can get down to the surface and get back up to rendezvous. All of that is so different than saying, we're going to be first, we're going to push, we're going to make a milestone. I heard a really good analogy recently, with the risk of being verbose. It was talking about, kids building straw towers. I don't know if that was something you did when you were in school, but you build the tallest straw tower that you can. The Soviet Union was building straw on top of straw on top of straw, and if it started to fall over, they'll fix that and keep building up, go quickly up. Whereas the United States, Apollo, was about building a good sturdy foundation, and then the good sturdy second level, and a good sturdy third level. And what happens is, eventually, even though the first group, their straws get up higher and higher faster at first, eventually the foundation wins, the strong foundation wins. And that's what we saw with the space race. So now that I've been going on about that for a little bit, do you have any thoughts on kind of how, is Artemis kind of a space race too?
I mean, I love that analogy that you had, right? That's building on straws. And we really did approach the 1950s and 60s space exploration by building blocks, right? That building up of those foundations and those key aspects. And we didn't know at the time what the Soviets were doing. Today, we still don't know. I mean, what risks were taken, what missions failed. I don't think we'll ever fully find out, the entirety of the picture of the Soviet era space flight. And it was such a unique time. This was a proxy war for the Cold War. You had that providing so much political motivation. Then you have this young president who says we'll get to the moon by the end of the decade, who's then assassinated. And so now you want to honor his memory, right? And so there's this political will as well as this engineering perspective that got us there in the first place. And so to your question of today, I think we're in a really different situation. There's a lot of questions of, are we in a new space race, possibly with China? China has really awesome little rovers operating on the far side of the moon right now, providing excellent data. But is it the same kind of feel? I don't know. I'd be interested to hear your perspective too. If you feel that same pressure, I don't.
I would agree with you. I wasn't around for the Apollo missions, but from anyone I've spoken to who was, the way they expressed the level of tension that the Cold War brought, whether it was worries of nuclear war. I think it was Apollo was a big win, not with war, but a big win emotionally, culturally, and politically, I suppose, for the United States. And it's just the stakes aren't as high today. We'll talk a little bit about private sector spaceflight eventually, but there's, like you said, there's not the political will. There's not the budget is far less of a percentage-wise of today's budget than it was, 58 years ago for Apollo. It was a much larger budget. But again, they had to do everything from scratch. I think it's easy to look at history and say, oh, it's got to repeat. We need we need this race, this romanticism of the original space race, and we need to do it again and beat China. And I don't know that our culture is like that now. I don't know that we have this big proxy war to fight. I don't know that we have this big political will. I don't know that we have this need. And I think you can see that when you talk to the public. Anybody I talked to about it was like, oh, the Artemis launched, right? That's the moon thing, right? Right.
Well, I mean, in some ways, all for the better that it's not this us versus them mentality, that we've built this spirit of collaboration through the International Space Station. And we're continuing with Artemis. I mean, the European Space Agency is helping build portions of the Orion spacecraft and some of the exploration modules, and the Lunar Gateway that is eventually going to be part of this after Artemis 3, hopefully, is another international space station. So I think that spirit of collaboration is, while maybe not motivating us to do it faster, is a healthy thing that can make a program stronger as well.
And we have so many new nations going into space as well. India, the United Arab Emirates. We're seeing more partners in the European Space Agency as well. So all of those are very, very good. Yeah, there you go. Right,
can't forget them.
No, I can't. I can't forget them at all. I have some good facts for you about Apollo regarding Canadians.
Ooh.
Now, this is something I heard about a few years ago. I had to double check it before the show, but Canadians were actually the first on the moon. Okay, so the legs that the landing craft for the LEM used to actually set down on the lunar surface, they were designed and built by a company headquartered in Quebec. So it's Canadian. Yeah. Heru Machine Parts. And I apologize to anybody who is French. I'm butchering your language, but in Quebec they built the legs. They designed and built them there. It's very petty of me to do this, but yes, Canadians were the first to land on the moon. Just saying.
I think that's awesome. That is fantastic that we had some of that international collaboration so early on. You should claim that, absolutely.
Totally. You know what? I like Canada's role in space a lot. I think that we do a lot of good things with what we have. We don't have the budget, the population of the United States, but the will is there. We're close neighbors and collaborative neighbors, and I treat every American space flight as partly my own as a Canadian, because it's such a point of pride for us as well.
And you've got Chris Hadfield.
Yeah, well, that's it, right? Yeah. So, Quentin, I was curious about your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, kind of expanding on what Naomi was saying, that if space travel has sort of become more of a spirit, more done in the spirit of collaboration as opposed to competition, perhaps that doesn't lead to developments happening as quickly, but it does lead to, I guess, developments happening on a healthier basis. I think that's a really interesting point of view, and I really hope that is the future of space travel, and that trend continues, and that we do see that as we continue to develop the means of exploring space, that we do it on what I hope will be peaceable terms, where it's viewed as the common heritage of all humanity.
Very well said. And I'm going to use that to do a little bit of a reminder that, hey, everybody, you're listening to York Universe. We're broadcasting live from Alan I. Carswell Observatory here at York University in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. This is Quentin, myself, Ryan, and our special guest, Naomi Paquette, talking about all things Apollo and Artemis and history and the space race. And is there a new space race? Probably not. But it's been a really fun discussion so far. And if you are interested in joining the discussion a little bit more, you can find us on Twitter at YorkU Observatory, or you can go to the online public viewing at observatory.info.yorku.ca. Now, I did mention a little bit earlier to our guests that we were going to be talking about the private sector a little bit. And the question that I have for both of you really is the public sector the best place to do human exploration of space? Is it the best, I guess, not industry, the best organization to do that? Or are private companies the future? Is the private model better than the public model for human exploration of space? Is space tourism the right thing? Public or private? What do you think, Naomi?
Oh, I'm so torn on this question. Because on the one hand, SpaceX has gotten us to be independent again and being able to get back to the International Space Station. I briefly mentioned the Constellation program, which is was the start of what became Artemis. And its goal was to return us to the International Space Station after we retired the space shuttle, and then go on to the moon. And that got slogged down over budget. And so President Obama shifted that focus and said the private sector is how we're going to do it. And we've seen SpaceX certainly be less risk averse. I mean, how many rockets did they crash trying to land one, right? but they have a different attitude that's pushed us forward. And at the same time, I can't fully say that I want to see just space tourism and not this international collaboration. So I'm kind of torn in between. I don't know how to give a good answer. I think the answer is something in all of it.
Do you have some thoughts, Quentin?
Yeah. If you'll forgive me for making what may seem like a little bit more of a cynical answer. Personally, I worry about the future of private space exploration, because I guess what concerns me about it is I really do think that space should be the common heritage of all humanity. I do think that whenever we see a big accomplishment happen in the future of space exploration and space travel, I want the entire human race to be able to look at that and think, we did that. And I do worry that if the entity that's responsible for all of these advancements is a private corporation that's funded by its shareholders, and that is accountable to the shareholders, and doesn't necessarily see itself as a representative of humanity as a whole, I worry about the way in which the future of space travel could be directed. And I also do kind of worry about the possibility of corporations owning sections of space, like the moon or colonies on Mars or the asteroid belt, and what that could mean for their employees and the people who are working there. So obviously the private sector is able to, at least currently, address a lot of the issues that the public sector seems to have, I guess, run into some difficulties with. But I really do hope that in the future and into perpetuity, we'll see the process of exploring space be seen as a collective effort by the entirety of the human race.
I mean, so far with the collective model, we've seen SpaceX getting NASA contracts. They're getting government money to go and produce some of the Dragon spacecraft and contracted for missions. That motivates them as a private company to go and build a rocket that works so that they can send astronauts safely to the International Space Station. And from the safety perspective, it certainly wouldn't be good for their reputation if astronauts were injured, hurt, heaven forbid, killed in the line of duty going up into space, right? So it's not good for their bottom line either. But what I would, and I love both the points that you both made, but what I would draw back to is aviation, right? The first people who flew were the wealthy, and the first companies that popped up only made flight accessible to the wealthy. And eventually it is something that we can all do. It's amazing that we can fly. I was telling Naomi, I was in Colorado in her state not that long ago, and I took a flight. I went on a plane and was able to travel most of the way across the continent to be there. That's pretty fantastic. And my hope personally is that the same thing happens with space flight. Ownership is a tough question, Quentin. I'm glad you brought it up, but
yes.
But when it comes to humans, the space flight being accessible to everybody, maybe space tourism is the way to get there.
That's an interesting thought. I mean, and I want to point out too that private companies have helped space exploration for a long time. I work with this collection of Apollo artifacts. They are from Grumman, which is now Northrop Grumman, right, who developed the lunar module, right? There was a company in Canada that built the legs for the lunar module. And so we've always contracted with private industry. It's just different now that we're allowing this space tourism. They're doing things on their own in addition to these contracts, right? And I'm with you. I'm a girl of the 90s, and so I grew up watching Xenon Girl of the 21st Century. I want to go live on a space station. I think that'd be awesome. And maybe somebody can get it to happen. I don't know.
I hope so. I mean, I guess the question then, I think the difference between contractors for missions and something like SpaceX is that SpaceX is holding the reins, right? They're the ones who are paying the money to contract those small companies to help them build their rocket. Whereas the difference with the public sector is that NASA holds the reins, the government holds the reins, the oversight, the safety holds the reins. So that I think is kind of the big difference that we're starting to see today. But who knows where it goes, right? That's the interesting part is, SpaceX has talked about going to Mars and putting I think just the other day, you hear Elon Musk say all kinds of things, but one of the things he said was, we're going to have 1 million people on Mars by 2050. I don't know about that, but...
And that's going to be an interesting question of space law. How do you do that, right? We have international treaties around this, and I had the great pleasure of speaking to a space lawyer. His name was Franz van der Donk. He is out of the University of Nebraska. We profiled him at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science as part of our exhibit, Space Odyssey. And it was just this interesting thing that space law is now picking up. This is a whole different realm that we have to address now as people like Elon Musk say, let's privately go back to the moon, privately go back to Mars. And even as other countries do it, right? How do we navigate those international treaties now that we're looking at long-term missions to the moon, even if it is government-sponsored?
Yeah, I wanted to say, as you said, Ryan, Elon Musk says all sorts of things. So perhaps we should take his projections for the future with a grain of salt. But if we did get 1 million people on Mars by 2050, that's a colony, right? Like if you have 1 million people on Mars, that can't just be for a couple of days. That's got to be a long-term project. And I do wonder if you have a private corporation establishing something like that, haven't you just kind of built like a company town in space where like your boss and your employer is effectively in charge of the entire settlement that you're in? That raises to me a lot of concerns about the future of workers' rights in this sector and what kind of what kind of power a worker would even have in a situation like that. You are millions of miles from home. This is part of the reason why I'm a little bit worried, I guess, about this possibility.
When it comes to the moon or asteroids, there's precious metals, there's mining, there's trillions and trillions of dollars of economic value on asteroids, on tiny asteroids. There's talk about taking an asteroid and putting it into orbit around the moon to be able to mine it. It's incredible. And so then those questions start to arise about, well, who owns this region of the moon for mining? Who can claim this region? It's the Wild West. It's actually almost like the gold rush a little bit. It remains to be seen what's going to happen. I suppose everybody's just kind of putting their heads down right now and saying, well, we have to get there first, but before we can start squabbling over all this other stuff. But those discussions need to happen now because eventually it will be too late, right?
Certainly.
Now, so tourism is an interesting angle as well. And I have to ask both of you, I asked this question of a lot of people. Would you take a trip to the International Space Station? Would you take a trip to the moon? Would you take a trip to Mars? And those are, I know, 3 distinct questions, but I want to hear your thoughts on if it was your shoes in the capsule, your boots, what would you do? Naomi, please.
So I may or may not have written to Jeff Bezos to propose the first wedding in space shortly after Blue Origins went up and I was engaged to my now husband. We're like, it's fine, we can scrap all our plans to get married on the Blue Origin capsule. Nothing came of this, obviously. We got married here on Earth. But for me, it would depend on the type of mission we would have to see. I don't know that I would want to go to the International Space Station. I'm claustrophobic, to be real honest with you. I don't know if psychologically I'm the right person to do that. Definitely wouldn't go to Mars. Maybe the moon? We'd have to see kind of what that travel might look like. Are we on the current NASA and even space tourism travel model, or are we on a more luxe tourism? Either way, I'm happy being an astronomer, terra firma, feet on the ground for now.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, Quentin.
Yeah, I mean, for all that I just said about like my concerns about the future of, I suppose, private extraterrestrial colonies, yes, I would absolutely go on one of those missions. If only for the novelty of it, if only for the how many times in your life do you get the opportunity to say that you've had something like that happen to you? And I know that, of course, there would be risks that would be associated with it, but to me, it seems like the opportunity to be a part of something like that, even if you don't know where it's going to lead, is something incredible. So yeah, I would go to the ISS. I would go to the moon. I would go to Mars if the opportunity were presented to me. Now, realistically, I don't think that I'll have enough funds to do anything like that anytime soon. But I would absolutely do it if the opportunity was presented.
I gotta say, I think that we've got the whole spectrum of ideas here about what we would do, because I'm kind of in the middle between the two of you. I would certainly go to the International Space Station knowing that it's a few hours trip. But the claustrophobia is a very good point as well. For me, it's the mission duration that does it, right? I mean, the moon, it's a week. Okay. 42 days if it's Artemis, that's fine. But, Mars is a long time. Mars is a multi-year journey. And I just don't like red that much. Not my favorite color. I'm not going to do a 4-year mission, to make the launch windows and spend time on the red planet. There's better people for that. That said, the overview effect, getting up to the ISS, taking a look back at the entire Earth, the blue marble, that is just something I don't think I could pass up. But at the moon, take it or leave it. Mars, no thank you. So there you go. There's the thoughts of your hosts on the show this evening. But I always like to ask that because I'm curious about what people's thoughts are. And I like, Naomi, that you said about, if the experience gets a little bit more posh, maybe we could do that, right? Maybe it wouldn't be so bad. Maybe they could recreate a nice earthbound environment on the spacecraft as you take the long journey out to Mars. Who knows?
I think I'd even be okay with some zero-G. Again, moon level, but I don't know, 8 months with a handful of crew members in a capsule the size of a school bus. No, thank you. To get to Mars. You got to have some really close friends there.
Yeah, there you go. Right. That's fantastic. So I've got a couple more questions that I wanted to touch on with the remaining time. Boy, does time fly when we're having fun like this. I wanted to talk a little bit about why we go to the moon. And, the people always ask, why? What's the point? We have all these problems here on Earth. This is the typical way of saying it. We have all these problems here on Earth. Why don't we solve the problems that we have here on Earth with all of that money? Why not spend that money on, solving hunger? There's war. There's domestic challenges. There's homelessness. There's all kinds of challenges that we have to face as a society. Why spend money to send a tin can to that rock up in the sky? Why do we do it?
I think it boils down to humans are fundamentally curious and are adventurers. We like to push the limits of exploration. And yes, we can do this with robots, but it's not quite the same as if we'd sent a robot out to Colorado versus a human, right? And living with the Wild West, right? And, there are two things that I think of. One is the fact that this push for technology is something that benefits us directly here on Earth. Looking at the Apollo spacecraft, one of my favorite spin-offs, if you will, is the fact that they had to figure out how to recycle water. Water is really heavy. You can't take enough to just throw it away, frankly, when you pee it out. And so this process of water filtration actually now directly applies to kidney dialysis machines here on Earth. Because it can remove that toxic waste used in dialysis fluid, and it saves electricity. It eliminates the need for continuous water supply, which is huge. And it also has helped us develop flame retardant textiles that we now use with firefighters, right? So there's direct applications with the technologies of new problems we find out in space. But the other one, that is this intangible. I heard an astronaut say it on CNN this morning, that humans are needed to inspire humans. We have a real problem with the STEM pipeline of inspiring that next generation to pursue science. I would love them to all be astronomers, but we need, everyone in STEM, right? All aspects of it. And spaceflight human spaceflight in particular, can be incredibly inspirational. And that's not something to be undermined either, or underestimated, I should say.
Well said. To your point of encouraging more young people to go into STEM fields, you mentioned earlier about, we've never launched as many rockets as we have since the Apollo era. I think last year or this year, or so far, it must have been last year then, was the first year where more rockets were launched from the surface of Earth than during the peak of the space race.
And we're sending incredible things out into space on those rockets. You mentioned the James Webb Space Telescope earlier. I mean, wow. Just wow. And we're sending humans back. We're sending probes to Mars and the moon. I mean, it's an incredible time of exploration. Exploration
is the thing that always resonates with me. I know, spin-offs is a thing that you can say to politicians to justify the funding, because you get something like $9 back for every dollar spent on spaceflight, at least. So, it's economically sound. But the exploration, humans always want to see what's over the next hill, right? What's across the next ocean or the next body of water. It's just a matter of time until we try to push further. And, as astronomers, we all know that eventually we're going to go after something that's too far away, or maybe we'll come up with a way to make everything come a little bit closer. It's pretty interesting. Quinn, do you have any thoughts on why we go to the moon and all this stuff?
Yeah, sort of expanding on what Naomi was saying about inspiration. When we send people to space, this is this is kind of coming back to what I was talking about earlier, about space being the collective heritage of humanity. There are a lot of problems here on Earth that we do need to focus on solving. But I think that sometimes, especially nowadays, when so much is in flux and there's so much that is confusing about the world around us, people start to feel like there is no solution to a lot of these problems. They start to feel like things are hopeless and nothing can ever change. And I think that big accomplishments like these, first satellite in space, first spacewalk, first person on the moon, first person on Mars, hopefully in the future, these are reminders that the humanity is capable of solving immense problems, that humanity is capable of doing things that our ancestors never would have even dreamed of. So I do think that part of what is valuable about these endeavors is that they remind us that we can solve problems, that we are able to advance, that we are able to improve, and hopefully we can turn that into motivation to turn around and fix the issues here on Earth, which in turn, as we improve the conditions for human beings on Earth, makes the next set of explorations more possible and more inclusive and better able to bring in, the entirety of human ingenuity behind the problem. So it really is about inspiration to me. I think that that's so important.
And to build off of that, it's not an or. It never should be an or. It should always be an and, right? It's not one or the other. We can do a lot, and we can turn that inspiration and that technology back to helping humanity. And for me, that's one of the really important things is it's and. We've learned so much about our own planet by going into space and studying space, and that's critically important too.
Excellent thoughts from both of you. I agree wholeheartedly. And to get towards the end of our episode, we got to do some science stuff. We're astronomers here. What, the south polar region of the moon is going to be the landing site. I almost cringe at myself asking this question, because I don't want to go away from just the beautiful discussion that we just had on the philosophy of spaceflight. But we got to pepper it in with a little bit of science. Why are we landing on the south polar region of the moon? Naomi, it's hard to get to. It's hard to do a polar landing. we've got plenty of, all the landing sites were on one side of the moon because of radio communications, needing a direct line of sight. But why the South Polar region? What is so great that's down there waiting for us to go and find it?
So the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter was really key in helping us explore this region of the moon, and we found something really exciting. We found these permanently shadowed craters, these craters where it reaches temperatures down to like negative 334 degrees Fahrenheit, where water ice exists, right? The moon does not have liquid water on its surface, and the South Polar region is one of the few places where water ice exists. So this is somewhere that not only do we want to follow the water, right, and exploring our solar system that leads to a larger NASA science directive of searching for life, probably not the case here, but we can have a resource for providing, possibly filtering down drinkable water for the astronauts, making the missions more sustainable, maybe even making rocket fuel, but certainly a really cool and unique area on the moon.
Well, it's interesting about water as rocket fuel, and you mentioned, and not just drinking water. It goes back to the earlier point about the atmosphere being difficult to get out of, right? The moon has no atmosphere. So it's once you're in space, it's a lot easier to get around. You don't need as much fuel. And so if we can synthesize some rocket fuel on the moon, there's your refueling station for the trip to Mars, which is the romantic in me, dreaming of a fueling station on the moon and all that jazz. But it's really interesting to me that, for all we talk about Artemis being this exploration mission, the milestones, the inspiration, getting humans back to the moon, there's still this huge scientific component. Everything we learned about the moon from Apollo is still not complete. There's so much more to learn, and this is one of the many reasons we need to go back.
Well, on taking the lunar samples, we've learned more from those Apollo lunar samples than we have from almost every other mission to the moon combined. And there is something interesting about humans. We can control rovers here from Earth, right? But humans have that ability to look around, assess the situation, go, wait, that's different. Let me look at that, and just find things that are unexpected. And to bring those samples back, and I'm jealous as an astronomer, planetary scientists actually get samples, right? How exciting would that be for the moon to bring fresh samples back from a new region of really intense scientific interest?
This is the thing, too. We tend to, as humans, reduce these very diverse places to very simplistic things. Oh, yeah, moon rocks are all gray, and they're all of one type, and they're all it's like we're going to go there and we're going to dig out a chunk and we're going to bring it back. It is a varied landscape, even though, it is various shades of gray. I remember Harrison Schmitt talking about orange soil on the surface, right? Like that's this really amazing, and he was so excited about it when he spoke of it. If you ever hear the audio clip from that, it's just, there's so much more diversity in the worlds that we see. And I talk about this a lot with Jupiter. I'm sure you both have seen some of the images of Juno flying around Jupiter up close and taking these just breathtaking views, tens of thousands of kilometers above the cloud tops. But it just shows you how diverse and interesting all of these different worlds are. And I usually use Jupiter as an example of why we need to go and visit these distant worlds. And the moon is no different. It is a diverse, interesting, fascinating world that we still have so much to learn about, so many different regions, and so much diversity that's just waiting to be discovered.
Absolutely. I think that we forget sometimes that the moon is a whole world, because we've seen footage now of people on the moon. We're so used to looking at the lunar surface from Earth. It all just kind of seems like one object, but it has its own geography. It has its own history. It is, it's not quite the same size as Earth, but there's still so much interesting information packed in there that I can't wait till we learn more about.
Now, unfortunately, we're reaching our time limit for our show. Although I know the three of us could continue talking for another hour.
Oh yeah.
I did really want to take this opportunity to say a huge thank you to you, Naomi, for joining us on the call tonight on the show. Quentin and I are lucky we get to do this often, or at least as often as we want to. But I'm really glad you could come and join us across the border and from the mountains. You're way up higher than we are. But thank you for giving us for sharing your expertise, giving us your thoughts, giving us your ideas. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on today.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed this conversation, and hopefully we can do it again in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And that's it, folks. So you've been listening to York Universe, the astronomy and astrophysics program written and presented by the students, faculty, alumni, and friends of York University. And stay tuned because there's lots more to come. Everybody have an excellent evening.
Thank you. Bye.
This program from AFM Radio,
Thank you.
the broadcast service of astronomy.fm. This program has been released under Creative Commons license. Please contact us for details. You may find more of our AFM original programs on our website. It's really easy to find us. We are astronomy.fm. You may also find us in the iTunes radio listings near the top of the News Talk section, and also as an iTunes podcast selection. We'd love to hear your comments. Please email us at radio@astronomy.fm. Thanks so much for being part of the voice of astronomy around the world and across the known universe. This is astronomy.fm radio.
AFM.